Every evening at sunset, I went to the little house I had built for her. I didn't do this from a plan or with any specific intention. I just felt drawn to the spot by some magnetic power which always increased toward evening and became quite irresistible when the sun set below the horizon. There were days when I had no intention whatsoever to go, when indeed I had pressing work on my hands. Each time, however, I simply had to drop everything to go to the little house in time for the rendezvous. With the moment I reached the cemetery, I always experienced a sudden relief from the urge, the pressure which had driven me on. I had indeed a date. I felt it. After a brief visit, I usually sat inside the door, completely relaxed and as contented as in the daytime I never was. Then I allowed my thoughts to wander, and they were all about my Elena. The troubled past reappeared before the mind's eye like a motion picture reel. At times I felt very tired in the consideration of this past, and then it happened that I fell asleep. 18 months after Elena's death had passed in this manner, there came a night when I sat inside the tomb near the metal coffin on a little chair. It had been a sultry day, and I had left the door wide open so that the refreshing coolness of the night could enter. The moist heat, however, was still in the little room, and this was probably the reason why I fell fast asleep. Suddenly I was aroused by a loud, crashing report, as if a cannon had been fired close to my ear. Thus, roughly awakened, I thought for a moment that perhaps some mischievous kid had fired a toy pistol to frighten me. But there was nobody around. Having patrolled the grounds outside, I returned into the tomb, and now I noticed by the reflection of the street lights outside that 50 locks which held the metal casket had sprung open. I examined them closely, and it was perfectly clear that they had been sprung with great force, and all at once, and that this must have been the loud report which had aroused me. Standing there in the semi-darkness, I smiled, for I remembered the prankish manner in which the ghost of my ancestor, the Countess Cosel, had manifested itself to me, smashing my laboratory equipment when I was a youngster. I also remembered how fond Elena always had been of the fun of a practical joke. This breaking of the locks looked very much like Elena to me. Perhaps she thought it funny to jolt her bridegroom in this manner, who had dared to fall asleep in her presence. Now I could clearly hear a tapping or a crackling sound inside, very distant, like nails of delicate fingers probing and scratching a metal surface. With spontaneous resolution, I got the keys out of my pocket and quickly opened the remaining locks of the casket, and with some effort I succeeded in lifting the heavy lid. Starlight revealed that the inner coffin was still intact and sealed. But since I felt the necessity for closer examination and was unable to hold up the lid by my strength for any length of time, I looked around for some means to prop it up. I happened to remember a piece of lumber lying around. I got it now. Lifting the cover once more, I could support it with the log, with enough space in between to squeeze head and shoulders in. I bent my ear to the inner coffin and listened intently. There was no sound, and I removed its lid altogether, putting it on the opposite side in the tomb. I tested every one of the 100 screws of the innermost casket. They were all intact. After screwing off the caps, I tested the top valve of the incubator, which had a filter of sterile cotton. As I took this filter out, a strange and pleasant perfume emanated and spread all over the room. There was no pressure of gas inside. There was only this mysterious smell which resembled a hamine, fragrant chemical in human blood, and not any manufactured perfume. It was exactly like the healthy and agreeable odor of a young woman's skin on a warm day. It simply was the typical odor which I loved so much of my bride, Elena, and of her hair. After a while, I placed my ear against the open valve, and after a minute or so I heard her voice. Very distinctly in soft tones, it sounded so very much alive that instinctively I looked around everywhere to see whether by any chance she was standing somewhere nearby. She wasn't outside the coffin, of course, but unmistakably she spoke from the air inside, and she said these words. "You do love me still, don't you? Tell me, am I really dead?" "Elena, my darling, no, you are not really dead. It's only your body that's asleep, and your spirit is dreaming." "Carlos, where am I?" "You are in a little house, darling, which I have built for you. I built it so you should not be disturbed and be protected in your sleep. Is this, then, your house too?" "No, darling," I said. "I'm only here to visit you and to wait for you to call me." Minutes passed in which she seemed to think this over, and then she spoke again. "I wish you would take me with you to your home. I want to stay with you." "With all of my heart, darling. I will take you with me, if needs be, to the end of the world." She gave no answer to this, at least not an audible answer, but it came to me as a divination that her lips kept moving down there and said something to me which I understood. That was why, after a while, I said aloud, "Yes, darling, I will do exactly as you wish. When the moon changes, it is to be. Then I will take you with me, and you will stay with me forever." There was no audible answer on her part to this, but a new wave of the familiar, the beloved fragrance of her sweet body arose strongly from the valve and filled the whole room. A long time passed in which I had the top end of her coffin embraced in silent reverie. At last I felt that now she wished to go to sleep, and it was time for me to leave her. It seemed cruel, however, to close the outer casket, so I left the lid standing open. With a last farewell, "Sleep sweet, and God bless you," I tiptoed out of the room. Now this may sound surprising, but the fact is that coming home to my room I felt wondrously at ease, elated, and at the same time very, very tired. I fell immediately asleep, deeply and soundly as a little child. From that day on, I brought her flowers every night, and other presents too. Well knowing how easy it was to make my Elena happy with some little thing, I always brought her a package of something bought on the way to her. One day it would be a few pretty handkerchiefs, the next a Spanish shawl, a comb, a vanity case. My greeting words were always, "God bless you, darling. I am so happy I am back with you." If this appears a strange or crazy thing to do, let me repeat that once in India I had lain for dead myself and had thought I still were in my bed, whereas in reality I had already been placed into the morgue. From this, my own case, and from many others on record, I knew that death is not the end of life, and that resurrection from the grave is actually a possibility. Naturally, the life of the dead is very different from normal. All the reactions are tremendously slowed down. There were days when Elena's spirit remained perfectly silent, and again days when it would answer to my words after an interval of 15 minutes or more. A curious fact was that Elena's spirit showed all the curiosity of a very young girl, a curiosity which extended to the content of my pockets. Sometimes I carried things from the hardware store which I needed for my plane. Invariably then Elena would ask me, "What is in that paper bag in your right coat pocket?" And I would laughingly explain, "Oh, darling, those are screws and little brass nails I need for your plane." Often she was not satisfied with the explanation unless I spread the screws and the nails, or whatever it was, on top of the coffin for her to see. By the same token, she insisted on all the amenities of polite conversation. I never failed to greet her and to say goodbye in the ceremonious Spanish manner. Unfortunately, my daily visits to the tomb and my prolonged stays there attracted considerable curiosity. Since the cemetery was located at the center of a public square with houses all around, it was easy for the innumerable children to lay siege on me. I realized that this was done not so much from mischievousness as from ignorance and lack of consideration. But it was very annoying indeed. Finally, I was forced to lock myself in the tomb and always draw the curtains, lest Elena's peace be disturbed. This reticence on my part seemed to provoke the kids still more. Their language became quite insulting. They kept their shouting up for hours, and when I finally left, there always was a crowd staring at me from across the cemetery fence. Several times I had talked to the boys and asked them kindly to leave off, but it was all in vain. Not knowing what to do, and after they had gone so far as to throw stones against my sacred tomb, I complained to the police. This helped for a while. I was sorry I had been forced to take this step, but to tell the truth, it never had occurred to me that people could be so much lacking in reverence as to disturb the peace of the dead. One Christmas afternoon I had come earlier than my usual hour in order to take a photograph of the tomb. Later, when it had become dark and I was sitting inside, all of a sudden I felt hands feeling all over my face and head. I could not see anything, but the touch was the familiar one of Elena's. That night at home I developed the picture I had taken. I had taken thousands of pictures with this selfsame camera, and it had never failed. This picture, however, showed a white shape, resembling a human figure, as if outlined in bright white light, standing at the entrance of the tomb. The constant nagging of the curious had irritated me so much that I changed my visiting hours farther into the night. It was the time of the full moon, and the cemetery almost as brightly lit as in the daytime, so it could not have been that my eyes deceived me when on my next visit I saw a veiled white figure at the entrance of the tomb. As I came near, it started moving as if it had been waiting for me. I hastened to meet her, but when I was only a few yards away, she disappeared through the locked door. Inside the tomb, I laid my hands on the casket and felt a strong electric current passing through my arm. The metal of this inner casket felt quite warm, almost of body temperature, whereas the outer casket was cold. The pleasing smell which emanated from the valve was particularly strong that night. As I always did, I held my hands over the valve into this beloved odor of my beautiful bride, Elena. It was remarkable how long this odor clung to my hands. Even washing would not remove it. Within the next week, the moon was waning fast. The nights became darker by end of the week. Only a narrow sickle of the moon was left. Ever since the moon began to wane, Elena had begun to sing in her casket with a very soft, clear voice, which became just a little stronger from night to night. It was always the same old Spanish song about a lover who opens the grave of his dead bride. I could distinctly hear and understand its every word. This always lasted for no longer than perhaps 10 minutes, and then she fell to silence as if expecting me to speak. "Darling," I would then say, "very soon now the moon will change. The hour approaches when I shall take you home with me. I will clean you and wash you, and I will put on your bridal dress with veil and crown and all. Thus, as my beloved bride, you will stay with me forever." 2 days before the moon changed, as I left the tomb and was already outside the cemetery, I suddenly had the queerest feeling that Elena wished to communicate with me. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned around and felt my feet, not like moving, but like being moved back to the grave. Thus walking, I remembered that there was a problem which for days I had pondered in my head, and that probably it was this matter she wanted to discuss with me. Putting my mouth to the valve, I said, "You know, sweetheart, your coming with me must remain a deep secret, and I have been wondering how we can keep it a secret. You see, this cemetery is surrounded by streets and by houses. It has several gates, but they are all in full view of the houses and automobiles, and are passing back and forth past the cemetery at all hours. People are curious. They are quite used to seeing coffins go into the cemetery, but they have never seen the dead come out again. If they see us, people might raise hell. What are we going to do about this, darling?" After a while, haltingly, but firmly came her voice. "Go out of the tomb, Carlos, and I will show you how this can be done." Now, standing in front of the tomb, I viewed with great misgivings the scenery around, the fact that the tomb itself lay in full view of at least a dozen inhabited houses, also in full view of the street. There was a fence around the cemetery, but it consisted of single rails and iron spikes so that it didn't hide anything, and the street was not farther than perhaps 40 feet away. Between Elena's tomb and the street there lay only one more grave, that of a woman, and it had a mound not higher than perhaps 2 feet, so this too did not offer any kind of cover. While I was still pondering what possible solution there could be, Elena's voice spoke directly into my ear. "You do it this way. When the moon changes, you bring along a very large blanket. You hang that blanket over the rail of the fence. Then nobody can see you from the street and from the houses, Carlos. The woman, my neighbor in the grave, she is my friend. She will be glad to help you." Unmistakably, Elena's spirit now used the full extent of its power over my nervous system. She directed my every step. I merely acted like a radio receiver to the waves which came from her. My mind was utterly relaxed. All I could think was, "Splendid, this is going to work." All I had now to do was to work out some means, to find some kind of mechanical device with which to move the heavy casket across the lawn to the point on the fence which Elena had indicated. I could not possibly carry it, because the heavy metal was altogether beyond one man's strength. Once I had reached the shadow of the blanket, the further journey would be comparatively an easy one. From this point on, I could proceed along a lane between 2 rows of graves which offered protection from sight. Automatically, my feet had been moved under Elena's direction to the fence, where I was to hang the blanket. Automatically now my feet were being guided by her through the dark part of the cemetery. This rehearsal of the drama in which I had to be an actor the following night was so perfect that it seemed to me as if the coffin were already following me. I just listened to her voice which guided me, which directed me in every turn so cleverly that I was always kept out of sight from the houses and from the road. There was not the slightest difficulty. I proceeded as if I were running on rails. Having crossed the cemetery in this manner, I felt my step being halted at the far end. The dark shadow of a deserted house loomed up directly in front of me, and within its expanse there was an even blacker shadow, square, an open window. There were houses to the right and left of the deserted one, but none of them had a window opening toward the cemetery. The cemetery fence ran perhaps 3 feet away from the wall of these houses. Again I heard her voice. "Into this window you shall lift me, Carlos, and I shall be safe in this deserted house, and from it later you can take me away in an automobile." "Yes, darling," I whispered. "Everything shall be done exactly as you say." I felt that she had left me. Nearby I found a small gate, one which I had never seen before. Passing through it, I went home. The next morning I went at once to where that little house stood and found that it was real. I was fortunate enough to rent it for a workshop and storehouse. Of course, I occupied it at once to make sure of my possession. Now I felt a tremendous relief. Happy, I walked through town toward the laboratory. In a shop window, while walking past, my eye was caught by a small but strong cart with rubber-tired wheels like children used to play with. Here again her voice called. "On this little wagon you will ride me along." I went into the store, asked to be shown the wagon, and soon convinced myself that wheels, axles, and frame were strong enough to carry the coffin. That certainly would help a lot in carrying the load. So I bought it and had it sent to my little house along with some other things such as carpenter's tools, etc. Evening came, and as darkness fell, I went to the tomb, taking my dark blanket and black rain sheet with me. Then, depositing it inside, seating myself beside the coffin, I rested. Her spirit seemed now attached to my own, but remained silent, listening perhaps. I spoke. "Tell me, darling, will you truly come to me? Will you not fail to aid me at the last moment, as I must count on your support?" In a few minutes promptly came her reply. "Yes, I will come with you and will help you." At last now I was sure and contented, and I sang a little song for her quietly into her coffin. It was the old German melody, "Come fly with me and be my wife, my heart thy resting place shall be," which I had written to her in a letter once before, and it was one of Mother's favorite songs. I was prepared to risk my life and to face any danger which would cross my path this night. There was no halfway, this was clear to me. Once it was started, it had to be carried out to a finish. This was my resolve. Besides, I did not know of a single person whom I could ask to help. Not a single human being I could trust who would be reliably discreet. And she would have to come out if ever I was to take proper care of her.